40 years. That's how long a quiet man named Arthur Jensen walked through Oak Park without a single person suspecting the truth he carried like a stain he thought would never come to light. For 4 decades he cut his lawn, waved at neighbors, attended block meetings, and lived as if nothing in his past had ever happened. People trusted him, some even admired his calm, simple routines. So when officers arrived in November 2024 and pulled this soft-spoken retiree from his front porch in handcuffs, the entire community froze, not out of confusion, out of betrayal, because this wasn't just another arrest. This was the arrest tied to one of Michigan's most haunting cold cases, a case so painful that families stopped speaking about it, a case that stole sleep from an entire generation. The shock came like a punch because Arthur Jensen was never a suspect in 1984. Not once. His name didn't show up in a single report, a single interview, a single footnote. Yet he was the man who held the answers to a disappearance that shattered a family, demolished trust, and left Southfield carrying a wound that never closed. Parents who raised their kids to trust the quiet, polite man next door suddenly questioned every memory. Neighbors who once chatted with Jensen on warm evenings stood outside their homes in disbelief, whispering the same horrifying question, "How did we miss him?" And somewhere in that crowd, with her hands shaking, stood Audrey Vance, the sister of the young woman whose life Jensen ended. For Audrey, the ground didn't just shift, it broke. Have you ever trusted someone simply because they seemed harmless? This case shows how easily that trust can cost everything. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. If you're a fan of true crime and cold case investigations, you won't want to miss our new book, 50 Cold Cases Solved. 50 real stories of the world's most notorious cases where time almost erased the truth until one clue changed everything. Now available for instant digital download. You'll find the link in the video description and in a pinned comment. Now, let's dive into today's case. The moment Arthur Jensen's name hit the news, a chill swept across Southfield, the kind of chill that makes a community question everything it thought it understood about safety, trust, and the people living just a few houses away. Because for decades, this case circled 3 men whose names were dragged through the mud. 3 men who lived under suspicion. 3 men who could never fully rebuild their lives. Yet none of them were the one who silenced a 25-year-old journalist with her whole future ahead of her. So the real question dug deep into everyone watching the story unfold. If the police, the press, and an entire city spent 40 years looking in the wrong direction, how did the real culprit stay invisible? That's the part that made people angry. Not confused angry. Angry that a young woman's life was stolen. Angry that her parents died without answers. Angry that technology had to do the work human beings couldn't. Angry that a man capable of such cruelty lived comfortably while others suffered because of a lie written by silence. And at the center of all that anger is a name the world should have never had to learn this way. Tahlia Merrick. A woman whose story should have been about triumph, not tragedy. A woman who stepped into the world fighting to expose corruption and ended up becoming the case that defined Southfield for an entire generation. So the real question becomes, if someone like Jensen could walk freely for 40 years, what else have we been wrong about? The morning Arthur Jensen was arrested, Southfield felt something it hadn't felt in decades, the sting of an old wound ripping open all over again. People who had long tried to forget 1984 suddenly found themselves pulled straight back into the night. Everything changed. You could see it in the faces of the older residents, people who remembered exactly where they were when Tahlia's disappearance first hit the news. Their eyes said it all. We lived through this once. We weren't prepared to live through it again. Audrey Vance wasn't prepared either. She had carried her sister's absence like a weight strapped to her chest, a weight she learned to survive with but never escape. She knew justice might take years, but she never imagined it would take most of her life. And when she finally heard the name of the man responsible, her reaction wasn't relief, it was devastation. Because the truth didn't just expose a killer, it exposed the fact that an entire city failed her sister. Parents told their kids not to linger outside in those days. Women checked their locks twice before bed. The community lived in fear, waiting for answers that never came. And while they feared the wrong people, the real threat lived a short drive away, sipping coffee in a diner where families gathered, walking through grocery aisles unnoticed, resting comfortably under the protection of the community's blind trust. So here's the question that should unsettle every single viewer. If someone like him could blend into everyday life for 40 years, how many dangers do we walk past without realizing it? Southfield had always told itself that the past was settled, that some tragedies simply fade with time. But Jensen's arrest shattered that illusion in one violent moment. It reminded everyone that the past doesn't fade just because people are tired of remembering it. It waits, it lingers. It presses its hand against the window until someone finally forces themselves to look. And now, after 40 years of unanswered pain, the city had no choice but to look. News vans lined the streets. Reporters repeated Jensen's name with the same disbelief the community felt. Former detectives, now old and struggling to forget their failures, watched the coverage with clenched jaws. Parents who once warned their children to be careful in 1984 suddenly felt that old fear return, the fear that someone could steal a life without warning and walk away untouched. But the person carrying the heaviest weight was Audrey Vance. For decades, she had been the lone, stubborn voice, refusing to let her sister disappear into silence. She kept Tahlia's case alive when the world moved on. She faced people who rolled their eyes, people who whispered that some cases just never get solved. She lived with the ache of knowing the world forgot something she could never forget. And when Jensen was taken into custody, Audrey knew something horrifying. This wasn't closure. This was the beginning of a truth darker than she ever imagined. Because now the question hanging over Southfield wasn't, "Who did it?" anymore. It was, how did everyone miss the right man for 40 years? Southfield in 1984 lived in a strange balance, a place trying to convince itself that danger stopped at the Detroit border. The lawns were neat, the homes were steady, and the residents repeated the same line whenever something unsettling happened in the news. That doesn't happen here. People clung to that idea the way some cling to routine, hoping that safety is something you can protect just by believing in it hard enough. But beneath the quiet evenings and friendly waves, the region carried its own kind of pressure. Factories were downsizing. Families were fighting to stay afloat. Most people tried not to show it, but worry hung over the community like an unspoken truth everyone pretended not to notice. Into this world moved a young woman who refused to settle for silence. Tahlia Merrick, 25, sharp-minded, bold-hearted, and always carrying a notebook she filled with every detail that caught her attention. She drove a bright red Ford Escort she proudly named the Firecracker. Partly because of its color, partly because it moved faster than anyone expected. Tahlia wasn't the type to blend into the background. She had a way of making strangers feel comfortable and a way of making the powerful feel nervous. Her colleagues at the Oakland County Sentinel often joked that she could make a story appear out of thin air, not because she exaggerated, but because she paid attention to things others overlooked. She dreamed of covering major stories, the kind that exposed truth and changed lives. But until that opportunity came, she poured her energy into every local assignment with the same passion. She believed every voice mattered, every detail mattered, every choice mattered. And that belief would lead her toward a story far more dangerous than she realized. To understand what was lost, you have to understand how Tahlia Merrick lived. Every morning in her modest Cranbrook Drive apartment, she followed the same quiet ritual: a cup of strong coffee, a quick scan of the newspaper, and a scribbled list of story leads she wanted to chase that day. She wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't chasing rewards. She was chasing truth, even the small ones. At 25, most people her age were still trying to figure out who they wanted to be. Tahlia already knew. She wasn't driven by pressure or expectation. She was driven by conviction. She believed information could protect people, and silence could trap them. She carried that belief like a second heart. Her co-workers admired her energy. Her sources trusted her. Neighbors remembered her as the young woman who always greeted them warmly, even when she was exhausted from long nights at the newsroom. She had a kindness that didn't feel forced, paired with a determination so strong that even her closest friends sometimes worried about how far she'd push herself for a story. But there was another side to Tahlia's rhythm. Her need to follow instincts others would ignore. When she first mentioned the municipal corruption lead, her editor urged caution. Not because he doubted her, but because, deep down, he knew the kind of trouble powerful people could create when someone pushed too close to uncomfortable truths. Yet she didn't back away. She took notes. She made calls. She worked late. Because she believed that some stories weren't just stories, they were warnings waiting to be understood. And somewhere in the middle of those long nights and quiet risks, a single object would soon become the center of everything, a small silver locket she had never seen before, yet would change the course of her life. Tahlia didn't just work in journalism, she lived it. Her friends often joked that she saw stories where others saw routine. A passing comment, a strange receipt, an unusual meeting at City Hall, nothing drifted past her without landing somewhere in her mind. There was something restless inside her, but not the kind that came from chaos. It came from purpose. So when she stumbled across suspicious inconsistencies within Southfield's municipal spending records, she felt something click into place. This wasn't just another assignment. This was the kind of story she had been waiting for, the kind that exposed what powerful people prayed no one would ever question. She tried to keep her excitement quiet, but those close to her noticed the shift. Ellie saw it in the way Tahlia stayed longer at the office. Her editor saw it in the way she pressed harder in meetings. Even a few city employees noticed her persistence and began treating her with the sort of careful politeness that speaks louder than threats. But here's what made the situation even more intense. Tahlia wasn't reckless. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what kind of trouble she could stir by digging into the wrong pockets. Yet she continued anyway. What would you have done at 25? Would you have stepped back? Or pushed forward, knowing someone was uncomfortable with your questions? This is where the world around her started to shift quietly, steadily, almost imperceptibly. She didn't know it yet, but her determination was placing her on a path that would connect her fate to a stranger she had never met. Someone watching from just far enough away to remain unnoticed. And decades later, the truth of that night would be traced back to a single misplaced item, a silver locket waiting to disrupt a city's story. Southfield moved at its usual steady pace during the fall of 1,984 families preparing for the colder months, students settling into routines, workers navigating long commutes and tight budgets. Life felt predictable, or at least steady enough for people to believe they understood the world around them. Tahlia, however, sensed something shifting, not in the city, in her own work. The more she explored her corruption lead, the more resistance she met. Calls that used to be returned immediately suddenly took days. Officials who once greeted her with confidence began giving clipped, evasive answers. She wasn't new to discomfort, but this felt different. It felt as though someone was hoping she'd stop looking. But she didn't stop. She filled pages of her notebook with names, dates, unexplained transactions, and details she didn't fully understand yet. She planned to organize everything after her weekend with her grandmother, a quiet promise she made to herself as she packed the small suitcase sitting on her bed. What she didn't notice, though, was the subtle shift happening around her. A shadow she didn't recognize. A presence watching her movements with growing interest. Someone who had no connection to her investigation, but would become the final thread in her life story. Hours before she disappeared, that person dropped something, a small silver locket, a piece no one could explain. A piece out of place in her world. A piece that would one day expose everything. But in 1984, it was just an item no one understood yet. And as we step deeper into her story, remember this. We examine stories like this together. Join us, stay informed. October 18, 1984 began like any other long workday for Tahlia Merrick, but the newsroom carried a strange heaviness as the night dragged on. Most desks were empty by 9 p.m. Fluorescent lights hummed. Phones stopped ringing. Yet Tahlia remained, hunched over her notes, determined to finish her work before taking her weekend trip. She wasn't supposed to stay that late. Even Ellie reminded her earlier in the day, "You promised your grandma you'd leave on time." Tahlia just laughed it off, insisting she only needed a few more hours. By 11:30 p.m., she finally packed up her things. As she stepped into the dim parking garage, the sound of her heels echoed through the concrete space, breaking the stillness around her. Ellie was waiting near her own car, arms crossed, wearing the familiar half-annoyed, half-affectionate expression reserved only for the people she cared about deeply. Their conversation was short but warm, the kind of exchange that feels meaningless until it becomes the last one you'll ever have. Ellie teasing her for overworking. Tahlia promising she'd get real sleep at her grandmother's. One final hug. One final wave. Just as Tahlia opened the door to her bright red escort, Ellie threw her a concerned look. "Be careful with that story," she warned quietly. "People get nervous when the wrong details come out." Tahlia smirked, brushing off the concern but not mocking it. "I know what I'm doing, Elle. See you Monday." It should have been routine. It should have been safe. It should have been forgettable. But someone else was there that night watching her leave, studying her routine, waiting for a moment she didn't realize she had handed away. Tahlia's walk out of the newsroom should have been unremarkable, yet something about the night carried a quiet pressure she couldn't name. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the weight of the corruption story she'd been digging into for weeks, or maybe it was the lingering echo of her editor's earlier warning. Harrison Thorne had pulled her aside just before he left for the evening. His tone wasn't scolding, it was uneasy. "Just slow down on that lead for a day or two," he murmured. Not an order, not a threat. A suggestion laced with worry. Tahlia respected him, but she wasn't someone who backed away because a door felt heavy to push open. She believed that truth didn't wait for convenience, and she wasn't about to let fear hers or anyone else's decide her next move. Still, Thorne's voice lingered in her mind as she started her car. A hint of trouble. A hint of caution. But nothing she believed she couldn't handle. She drove out of the garage, headlights cutting through empty streets washed in the orange glow of street lamps. Her thoughts bounced between her notes, her weekend plans, and the feeling that she was close, painfully close to something big. Something that could define her career. She didn't notice the vehicle pulling out from a side street as she turned toward home. She didn't see how long it followed her, how steady the distance stayed, how carefully someone tracked her movements as if they'd been waiting for her to leave alone. She thought the night was hers. She thought she was heading towards safety, but someone else had already decided otherwise. The drive from the newsroom to her apartment usually felt comforting to Tahlia. Southfield's late-night streets were calm at this hour. Storefronts dimmed, traffic vanished. The only sounds were her engine, the low rattle of her cassette player, and the occasional distant hum of a passing car. She loosened her shoulders for the first time all day. Her mind started drifting to her grandmother's house-warm meals, old family stories, the rare chance to unplug from work. She'd needed that break more than she admitted, but she didn't notice the vehicle behind her maintaining the same pace, turning when she turned, slowing when she slowed. Never too close, never too far. To her, it was just another car on a quiet night. She made a quick stop at the Silver Skillet, the all-night diner she visited whenever she worked late. A cup of coffee, a small snack, just enough to keep her awake until she finished packing. The employees knew her by name. Her order never changed. She smiled, left a tip, and headed back to the firecracker. Still, she didn't see the same vehicle pull into the lot a minute later. Didn't see the figure inside watching her through the windshield. Didn't sense the interest. Didn't feel the shift in attention that had settled on her. As she drove toward her apartment, she hummed softly, unaware of the shadow following from just out of view. A shadow with no connection to her investigation, no motive tied to her articles, no reason to appear in her mind as a threat. Yet this was the moment her story changed. She thought safety waited at home. She thought rest was just minutes away. But someone had already chosen that night for her. By the time Tahlia turned into her apartment complex, the night felt quieter than usual. Even for Southfield, the silence carried a strange weight, not threatening, not loud, just heavy. But she didn't pause to question it. She parked her red Escort in her usual spot, gathered her notes, and locked the door with the same casual confidence she had every other night. She didn't realize the vehicle that had followed her for miles had stopped just far enough away to blend into the shadows. She didn't hear the soft click of an engine turning off. She didn't see the figure watching her walk toward her building, observing her every step as if memorizing it. Inside her apartment, the suitcase on her bed waited to be finished. A few clothes left to fold. A small list taped to her dresser reminding her what to bring. plans for the weekend still warm in her mind. This was supposed to be a night of peace, a night to rest, a night to look forward to something comforting. But somewhere outside, someone had already crossed a line she didn't know existed. Someone who didn't know her name, didn't care about her work, didn't care about her investigation. Someone who made a choice that would end her life and fracture a community. She never called her grandmother. She never finished packing. She never realized a stranger's attention had shifted from watching to acting. She wouldn't make it to her weekend. She wouldn't make it to Monday. And decades later, investigators would learn something chilling. Not every danger announces itself. Subscribe before the next twist hits. By Sunday morning, Ellie Albright had an uneasiness she couldn't shake. Tahlia never missed a check-in, especially before visiting her grandmother. She was dependable to the point that even a delayed call felt strange. But an entire morning with no word? That wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. Ellie tried to reason with herself. Maybe Tahlia overslept. Maybe she left early and forgot to call. Maybe the long week finally caught up with her. But the quiet inside Ellie's apartment felt wrong, heavy, pressing. And the more she thought about their last conversation, the smile, the hug, the unspoken concern in Tahlia's eyes, the more her stomach tightened. By noon, she grabbed her keys and drove straight to Cranbrook Drive. When she reached Tahlia's building, something inside her dropped. The door to Tahlia's apartment wasn't just unlocked, it was open. Not wide, not forced. Just slightly unlatched, as if someone pulled it closed but didn't care enough to make sure it caught. Ellie froze. A part of her wanted to call out her friend's name, but something deeper warned her not to. She pushed the door slowly, her heart pounding hard enough to hurt. Inside, the air felt still unnaturally still. A half-packed suitcase sat on the bed, clothes folded neatly, others tossed in a rush. A jacket draped over a chair, notes scattered on her table. Her purse untouched. Nothing broken, nothing stolen. But something was terribly wrong. Tahlia was nowhere in sight. And on the kitchen counter lay an object that didn't belong, a silver locket, old, worn, and far too personal to be hers. A locket that would change the course of the entire investigation. Ellie stepped inside with slow, cautious movements, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. It wasn't the kind of wrong you sense in a messy room or a forgotten chore. It was the kind that sinks into your bones before your mind can fully understand it. The apartment was quiet, but not the comforting kind of quiet she knew so well from her late-night visits. This silence felt heavy, unnatural, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Tahlia's suitcase was still open on the bed, only half filled. A pair of shoes sat neatly beside it, waiting to be packed. Her favorite sweater, the one she always wore at her grandmother's, lay folded on top. None of it made sense. If she had left on purpose, she would have taken everything she needed. If she had rushed out for an emergency, her purse wouldn't still be on the counter. And if she had simply forgotten to call, the door wouldn't be hanging open like a quiet warning. Ellie's eyes drifted toward the kitchen, and that's when she saw it. A small silver locket, placed neatly in the center of the counter. Old, tarnished, out of place, as if someone set it down deliberately. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. Tahlia never wore jewelry like that. She never mentioned owning anything like it. And the initials engraved on the front PM meant nothing to Ellie. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. And for the first time that day, fear hit her in full. Something had happened here. Something she couldn't name, but could feel in the pit of her stomach. Tahlia didn't leave this behind. Someone else did. Ellie stood in the center of the apartment, clutching the locket, feeling her heartbeat hammer against her ribs. She called out Tahlia's name once softly, as if afraid to disturb something. When no answer came, she called again, louder this time, her voice cracking halfway through. Still nothing. It wasn't just that Tahlia wasn't there. It was the kind of absence that felt wrong. A sudden void that suggested she hadn't stepped out willingly, hadn't left for a moment, hadn't planned to come back. It was the kind of absence you feel before you understand it. The kind that makes your stomach twist before your mind catches up. Ellie backed out of the apartment with shaking hands and ran down the stairs to the lot. A part of her still hoped she'd find something normal, maybe Tahlia's car missing because she left early, maybe a neighbor who saw her leave. But when she reached her usual parking spot, hope evaporated. The scarlet Ford Escort. The firecracker was gone. Panic surged up like a wave. Her eyes darted across the lot, searching for any sign of red, any sign of movement, any reason to believe she was overreacting. Instead, she found the car 2 blocks away, parked crookedly at the curb, as if someone stopped in a hurry. The doors were locked. The windows untouched. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked broken. But cars don't drive themselves, and Tahlia never parked like that. By now Ellie knew, without question, that something terrible had happened. The open door wasn't an accident. The locket wasn't a coincidence. The abandoned car wasn't a mistake. Someone else had been with Tahlia that night, and they didn't want to be seen. When Ellie called the police, she could barely get the words out. Her voice shook. Her breath trembled, and every sentence came out fragmented. But there was one thing she repeated over and over. Tahlia wouldn't leave her door open. She wouldn't leave her car like that. Something's wrong. Detective Calvin Reed arrived within minutes. Young, focused, and still carrying the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been worn down by years of disappointment, he stepped into the apartment with a seriousness that clashed sharply against the stillness inside. He didn't need Ellie to explain much. One look at the half-packed suitcase, the untouched purse, the abandoned car, and the old locket on the counter told him everything he needed to know. This was not a simple disappearance. This was the start of something bigger, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Reed studied the locket, turning it slowly in his hand. It didn't match anything in the apartment. It didn't match anything in Tahlia's life. The initials PM only deepened the confusion. "Does this belong to her?" he asked. Ellie shook her head instantly. She never owned anything like that. Reed's expression hardened. A stranger had been in this space. A stranger had stood where he stood now. A stranger had left a clue that made no sense unless it was meant to. As the investigation unfolded, the locket would become the loudest silent message in the entire case. And the question that would haunt Southfield for decades started here. Why leave a locket? And who was PM? If someone vanished next door, would you notice? Stay prepared, subscribe. Detective Calvin Reed's first stop was the Oakland County Sentinel. If anyone understood Tahlia's recent movements, it was her editor. Harrison, Thorne, and Reed needed answers fast. Thorne greeted Reed with a stiffness that didn't feel like fear, but tension. The moment Tahlia's name came up, his composure cracked just enough for Reed to notice. He sat behind his cluttered desk. Hands pressed together, eyes unfocused. Tahlia was talented, he said quietly. Too talented for her own good sometimes. Reed asked about her workload, her stress levels, any conflicts she'd mentioned recently. Thorne hesitated before admitting the truth. Tahlia had been digging deeper into her corruption story than he wanted. He had warned her to pull back, to give herself space, to avoid stirring trouble she didn't fully understand. But when Reed pushed for more, "Why were you so concerned?" Thorne's voice slipped into frustration. Because she wouldn't stop. She wanted this story more than she wanted sleep. It wasn't anger at her, it was fear for her. Yet Reed couldn't ignore another possibility, fear of what she might uncover. Then came the question Reed had been circling toward. "Where were you the night she disappeared?" Thorne answered quickly, a late editorial meeting lasting past midnight. Security logs backed his claim. 2 junior staff members confirmed it. His alibi was clean, and yet something in his behavior kept a small alarm ringing in Reed's mind. Not guilt, something harder to read. Something he couldn't name. Was it worry? Regret? Or something darker he wasn't ready to admit? The investigation had only begun, and already the lines were blurring. 1 suspect down, 2 more to go. While Thorne's interview left Reed uneasy but without leverage, the second name on the list carried a very different energy. Reginald Doss. The man neighbors whispered about long before police ever knocked on his door. He lived 2 streets away from Tahlia alone, private, and constantly watched by people who didn't actually know him. In a community hunting for explanations, he became the easiest target. When Reed and Detective Alcott arrived, Doss answered the door with an expression that hovered somewhere between confusion and annoyance. He wasn't surprised by the visit that alone told Reed the neighborhood had already vilified him. Inside, his home was cluttered but ordinary, books stacked everywhere, Old radios on tables, papers covering most surfaces. Nothing dangerous, nothing alarming, just a man who kept to himself. But rumors had built him into something far different. Reed asked about the night of October 18th. Doss said he'd been home repairing an old transmitter, listening to late-night broadcasts. Reed asked if anyone could verify it. Doss shook his head. That lack of an alibi pushed him deeper into suspicion. Then came the polygraph, a test Doss agreed to without hesitation. He failed. The moment news of that failure reached the public, people didn't question it, they celebrated it. They wanted a villain, and Doss fit the shape of one. But Reed wasn't convinced. A failed polygraph doesn't equal guilt. And nothing in Doss's home connected him to Tahlia. No fibers. No prints. No items belonging to her. Nothing linking him to the red escort or the locket. Still, the pressure mounted, the press circled, and the community demanded Reed make an arrest. But the evidence wasn't there. Just fear. Just assumptions. 2 suspects questioned. Still no answers. The third name on Reed's list wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had once mattered deeply to Tahlia Damon Sterling, the ex-boyfriend who still carried the weight of their past like a bruise that never faded. Reed approached him cautiously. People grieving someone they once loved can react in unpredictable ways, but from the moment Damon opened the door, it was clear he wasn't hiding behind anything. His eyes were red, not from sleep deprivation, but from hours of crying. He didn't wait to be questioned. "Is she okay? Did something happen?" The trembling in his voice made Reed pause. Inside his apartment, photo frames were still on the shelves, snapshots of better years. Not obsessive, not uncomfortable. Just remnants of a love that never ended the way either of them expected. Reed asked where he was the night Tahlia went missing. Damon answered immediately. "At my cousin's house. Chess night. We do it every Thursday." It sounded convenient, too clean. But Reed checked the story anyway, and every part of it held up. 2 witnesses confirmed it. Phone records matched. Even a time-stamped Polaroid placed him exactly where he claimed to be. But Reed didn't let go easily. He pulled Damon back in for a second interview, digging deeper, watching every reaction. Damon broke down halfway through. He blamed himself, not for what happened, but for not being in her life when she needed support. He said Tahlia had mentioned pushing into something dangerous weeks earlier but wouldn't let him help. That confession shook Reed more than anything. It meant her disappearance wasn't random. Someone had been bothered by what she was investigating. 3 suspects down. 3 lives examined. Still no direction, only mounting frustration and a sense that the real threat was still out there. By the end of that exhausting week, Reed and Alcott were running on adrenaline and growing frustration. 3 suspects had been dragged into the spotlight, examined, questioned, poked, and pushed, yet the truth stayed out of reach. Police headquarters became a battlefield of whispers and pointed looks. Reporters hovered outside the building, shouting questions Reed didn't have answers to. Supervisors pressed him harder, wanting a breakthrough he couldn't force, and every hour that passed without progress made Tahlia feel further away. Thorne's interview left cracks but nothing to hold on to. Doss became the neighborhood's favorite accusation, yet not a single piece of evidence supported the claim. Damon's alibi was airtight, his pain too raw to ignore. 3 men with completely different lives, and not one of them brought the case closer to clarity. Every detective knows the moment the room changes, when hope starts slipping and dread quietly takes its place. Reed felt that shift creeping in. The file on his desk felt heavier each day, as if Tahlia herself was waiting for him to figure out what everyone else had missed. Then came the mistake that broke the early investigation. Someone leaked that Doss had failed the polygraph. The city latched onto it like a final verdict. Reed was furious. The department now had a distraction, not a clue. Citizens pointed fingers. Phone lines lit up with sightings, none of which made sense. Tips poured in, most of them driven by fear or boredom rather than truth. And while the city was chasing shadows, the real threat stayed quiet. Reed felt it in his gut. Someone had planned this well enough to stay invisible. Someone who never should have been overlooked. But the investigation was too clouded, too chaotic, and too misguided to see that yet. By the end of week 2, something became painfully clear. The investigation wasn't just stuck, it was misguided. Reed sat at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. The clock on the wall clicked louder than usual, a reminder that time was slipping away, that Tahlia's chances were shrinking, and that every wrong turn carried a cost. 3 suspects. 3 stories examined inside out. 3 lives turned upside down. And yet nothing, absolutely nothing, brought him closer to the person who took Tahlia from her family. He opened the file again, flipping through pages he knew by heart. Interview transcripts, scene photos, phone logs, a map with circles, arrows, and abandoned theories. Everything pointed everywhere and nowhere. Alcott walked in quietly, dropping a fresh stack of community tips on the desk. "Another 60, she said. "None worth anything." Reed didn't respond at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "We're chasing the wrong people." It wasn't a guess. It wasn't an emotional reaction. It was the first honest conclusion he'd made in days, because none of the suspects had opportunity. None had access to her movements that night. None had a reason to take her just outside her own neighborhood. Someone else had been watching her. Someone who wasn't on their radar. Someone whose name hadn't been mentioned by a single witness. But who? Reed didn't have that answer yet, and the fear of what he might discover next settled into his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. Before closing the file, he whispered the question that would haunt him for decades. Where were we supposed to look? The early investigation had failed. The real story hadn't even begun. Who would you suspect at this point? Drop your theory in the comments. From the moment Ellie placed it in Reed's hand, the silver locket became the center of gravity in the case, a clue so personal it felt impossible to ignore. It sat cold against Reed's palm that first night, carrying a strange weight for something so delicate. Everyone expected it to reveal something. Everyone believed it would break the case open. Instead, it became the reason the investigation drifted in the wrong direction. The outside of the locket was smooth, ordinary, unmarked by damage. But the moment Reed opened it, everything shifted. On one side, a photo of a young girl with wide eyes and a stiff expression. On the other, an older man in uniform, posture straight, gaze hard. Neither face matched anyone connected to Tahlia. Not family, not friends, not colleagues, not sources. And carved on the inside hinge, almost too faint to notice, were 2 initials. PM. Those letters sent the investigation into a storm of assumptions. Reporters speculated it belonged to a secret partner. Whisper networks insisted it came from a hidden relationship. Some even suggested it was a message left by her abductor. But Reed felt something was off. Tahlia didn't wear jewelry often, and Ellie swore she'd never seen the locket before. Even Tahlia's grandmother, who remembered nearly every detail of Tahlia's life, said the same. So how did it end up on the kitchen counter? Reed sent it to forensics immediately. Fingerprints, residue, fibers, anything. Nothing came back useful. No prints. No DNA. Not even a hint of where it was purchased. A clue that should have guided them became the very thing that pushed them off the right path. The locket wasn't helping. It was misleading them quietly, effectively. And nobody understood why. Reed spent the next week chasing the 2 faces inside the locket, convinced one of them had to hold the missing piece. He carried enlarged copies of the photos from office to office, knocking on doors, asking every possible contact for help. It felt like a reasonable strategy until the truth began to reveal how misleading the object truly was. The girl in the photo looked no older than 9. Dark hair, uncertain expression, hands folded neatly as if she'd been coached to sit still for the camera. Reed studied her eyes again and again, trying to find even the slightest resemblance to Tahlia or any member of her family. There was none. The second picture, the older man in uniform, was even more confusing. His posture was rigid, gaze fixed straight ahead, the kind of photograph taken for record purposes rather than family memories. Reed checked military archives, veteran groups, retirement communities, even reached out to units stationed near Detroit in the late 72nd and early 82nd. Nothing. No match. No records. No confirmation he even existed. As for the initials PM, investigators tried everything: public records, social security databases, missing persons files. Dozens of names surfaced, but not a single one connected to Tahlia's world or the night she vanished. Each dead end stung. Each wasted hour added more pressure. Alcott eventually pointed out what Reed didn't want to admit. This locket might not belong to her. We might be chasing a stranger. If that were true, it meant something deeply unsettling. The only physical clue in the entire case, the object everyone clung to, might have been placed there intentionally, not as a warning, not as a message, but as misdirection. A distraction that worked flawlessly. Back in 1984, forensic science was nowhere near what it would one day become. Reed didn't have the tools investigators rely on today, no robust DNA systems, no advanced imaging, no digital enhancements. What he had was a silver locket that refused to cooperate. Technicians examined every edge, every crease, every hinge. Under bright lamps, the metal gave off a dull reflection, revealing nothing except age. They tried lifting prints multiple times, hoping for even a partial impression. Nothing. The chain was inspected for broken links or stretching signs. Someone might have yanked it off during a struggle. It showed none. No skin cells trapped in the clasp, no fibers tangled in the chain, no residue inside the frame. It was spotless in a way that didn't feel natural. Reed stood in the forensics lab, hands in his pockets, staring at the locket lying in an evidence tray. He knew impossible objects didn't exist in real investigations. Every item has a story, even if the story is intentionally hidden. But everything about this piece of jewelry felt out of place. Too clean, too disconnected from Tahlia's routines, too void of any trail. The absence of answers created its own kind of tension. It made Reed question whether the locket had ever belonged in her home at all. He started revisiting basic questions. Was it dropped, planted, delivered, or left to confuse them? Each theory felt worse than the last, because if it was planted, that meant the person responsible wasn't worried about getting caught. They wanted detectives looking in the wrong direction, and for years, that's exactly what happened. The locket wasn't a clue. It was a barrier, a quiet, polished obstacle designed to keep the truth buried. As the years passed, that small silver locket became an anchor around the investigation's neck, a reminder of how easily an entire case can be pushed off course. Every new detective assigned to the file circled back to it. Every cold case review opened with the same question: who is PM? But the truth was painfully simple. The locket didn't belong to Tahlia. It didn't connect to her life. It didn't connect to her last known steps. It didn't match anything in her home or her relationships. Still, it stole attention for decades. Every theory built around it collapsed. Every attempt to tie it to a suspect turned into a dead end. Even when technology advanced, new testing offered nothing fresh. The item remained stubbornly silent, as if it had been crafted to hide its story forever. Reed carried guilt for the rest of his career. He'd spent too much energy chasing strangers whose lives had nothing to do with Tahlia. The locket had distracted him at a crucial moment when he should have been looking somewhere else. It wasn't until 40 years later that the truth emerged. The locket had been placed intentionally, not by Tahlia, not by a family member, but by the person responsible for her disappearance, a misdirection so quiet and so calculated that it fooled everyone. The object that should have revealed the truth instead protected the wrong person for nearly 4 decades. One tiny piece of jewelry, one meaningless set of initials, one planted clue that held the entire city hostage. This tiny item held the truth all along. Stay with us, more ahead. By early 1985, Detroit had stopped holding its breath. The urgent whispers that once filled every corner store, bus stop, and front porch slowly thinned out. What started as a collective nightmare became a quiet ache the city didn't want to face anymore. People needed to work, bills needed paying, children needed raising. Life pushed forward, even when the truth never arrived. For Reed, watching the world move on felt like watching a wound scar over without healing. The case file, once thick with activity, began gathering dust. Supervisors reassigned officers to newer crimes. Press coverage died out. The only people still talking about Tahlia Merrick were the ones who loved her and the ones who had been wrongfully blamed. Reed hated the silence the most. It made him feel like the city had accepted defeat, but Tahlia's family didn't have that luxury. Her grandmother aged quickly under the weight of unanswered questions. Her sister, Audrey, refused to let her memory disappear. She attended every community meeting, spoke at every vigil, wrote letters demanding updates long after others stopped reading them. She carried her sister's absence as a daily burden, not a distant memory. Meanwhile, the three men once treated as suspects paid their own price. Jobs were lost, relationships collapsed, friendships evaporated. Even after the department admitted there was no evidence against them, the smear clung to their lives like a stain no apology could remove. Years stretched into decades. Each passing anniversary carved a deeper line in Reed's face. He couldn't escape the case. It followed him from station to station, from squad room to retirement paperwork. He called it unfinished business, but privately it felt like failure. The city forgot the details. Families didn't, and Reed never did. By the early 90s, Reed had solved dozens of cases: robberies, missing persons, homicides with clear motives and clean outcomes. But none of them mattered. Every win felt hollow, because the one case he needed to solve was the one he kept losing in his own mind. He carried Tahlia's file from office to office as he moved through the department. Some joked that he was superstitious. Others thought he couldn't let go. Only a few understood the truth. Reed didn't carry the case to remember her. He carried it because he refused to allow her to become another forgotten statistic. But time changes people. He grew older. Colleagues retired. New officers joined who had never heard Tahlia's name until Reed mentioned her in briefings. They listened politely, but the urgency wasn't there. The world had changed. Technology advanced. Cold case units expanded. Yet somehow her case remained untouched, buried under newer tragedies. Reed visited Audrey's home once a year. At first, those visits brought comfort to people holding on to the same loss. But as the years stretched, the visits grew heavier. Audrey's hope dimmed, shifting into something quieter. She no longer asked, "Any updates?" She simply asked, "Do you still think about her?" Reed always answered yes, because thinking about her was the only thing he could still offer. By the time 2010 arrived, Reed wasn't the same detective. He moved slower. His hearing wasn't as sharp. His hands shook slightly when he opened old folders. But he never stopped reviewing the same notes, the same photographs, the same false leads. Some nights he whispered to the empty squad room, "What did I miss?" He retired in 2014, but he took the case file home. Because he knew the story wasn't finished. Audrey Vance carried her sister's memory the way others carry oxygen, not by choice, but necessity. She was young when Tahlia vanished, but loss ages people faster than birthdays. By the time she reached her 32nd, Audrey had become the unofficial voice of the case. She wrote articles, organized vigils, and kept a framed photo of her sister in places where people couldn't avoid seeing it. Some called her persistent. Others called her difficult. She didn't care. Pain gives people a clarity the world often misunderstands. Every year she stood at the same community center podium, speaking to smaller and smaller crowds. Early vigils filled entire parking lots. By the 92nd, attendance had dropped to a few dozen. By the 2000s, sometimes only 4 or 5 people showed up. But Audrey never stopped. She believed silence was the easiest way to erase a victim, and she refused to let that happen. While she fought to keep her sister's name alive, the 3 men once labeled suspects lived in a different kind of prison. Harrison Thorne lost clients. Reginald Doss became socially isolated. Damon Sterling's relationships fell apart as partners questioned his past. None of them had been charged. None had been officially accused in court. But public suspicion is a punishment of its own, one that lingers long after the truth is set free. Some employers treated them like a risk. Neighbors avoided them. Friends drifted away. The city healed on the surface, but people like Thorne, Doss, and Damon carried scars nobody wanted to acknowledge. And Audrey, still grieving, still fighting, never forgot that Tahlia's disappearance had damaged far more than one family. By 2020, the case felt like a wound sealed shut too early. No answers. No accountability. No peace. By the time the 2010 seconds arrived, Tahlia Merrick's disappearance had become one of those stories people vaguely remembered but rarely discussed. A case mentioned in passing on local blogs, a name older residents recalled in quiet tones, a memory parents used to warn their kids about late-night errands but never with the urgency it once carried. Detroit changed. Neighborhoods transformed. Businesses closed and reopened under new signs. Entire generations grew up never hearing Tahlia's name at all. But those who lived through 1984 didn't really forget. They simply buried the unease beneath everyday responsibilities. The fear faded, yes, but the absence remained. Every so often, someone would bring her up at a dinner table or during a long drive home. The question always sounded the same. How did no one ever find out what happened to her? Reed, now retired, felt those words like a personal blow. He kept the case file on a shelf in his living room, unable to store it away with other memories. Sometimes he would open it late at night, running his fingers across pages he practically memorized. The margins were filled with notes, theories, frustration. He never admitted it aloud, but he feared he'd let the wrong clue guide him and he couldn't undo it. Audrey never stopped her yearly rituals. She cleaned her sister's room, kept her clothes folded, and maintained the small memorial garden behind her house. Hope changed shape over the years. It softened, lost its sharp edges, but it never vanished. While the city healed above the surface, the people touched most by the case carried invisible wounds. The kind time doesn't fix. The kind silence doesn't erase. Don't let victims fade. Subscribe for justice-driven stories. In 2020, Detroit's newly formed cold case unit opened its doors with one mission: confront the cases time tried to bury. Among the boxes lining their shelves was the file Reed had carried for decades, worn edges, fading ink, and a story begging for another chance. Most detectives skimmed past it, too old, too complicated, too broken. But Sergeant Lena Morales didn't. She was known for refusing easy wins and seeking the cases others avoided. The moment she read the first page of Tahlia Merrick's file, something locked into place. She didn't see old paper. She saw a life that had been abandoned by everyone except a grieving sister and a retired detective still torturing himself with what-ifs. Morales requested the entire evidence kit. When the box arrived on her desk, she paused before opening it, as if acknowledging the weight of every unanswered question inside. Inside lay the same items Reed had once held: the photos, the reports, the fibers collected from the red escort, and the silver locket that had sabotaged the investigation from the start. Morales didn't treat it like a relic. She treated it like an unfinished task. For hours, she sat alone, reviewing everything from scratch. No assumptions, no inherited theories, no trusting the conclusions of 1984. She examined the stain on the locket's clasp, the fibers found on the escort seat, and every overlooked detail written in Reed's notes. She circled inconsistencies others had accepted. She questioned choices older detectives never thought to revisit. By midnight, she pushed her chair back and whispered to herself, "This isn't a dead case. It was ignored by the wrong era." She was right, and the truth was about to surface. This next reveal changed everything. Stick with us. Sergeant Lena Morales wasn't the type to rely on luck. She trusted process, pattern recognition, and the power of modern tools that detectives in the 80 seconds could only dream about. And the more she studied the Merrick file, the more she realized something crucial. The evidence wasn't useless. It was simply too advanced for the time it was collected. Forensic genealogy had changed the investigative world. Instead of waiting for a suspect to show up in a criminal database, investigators could now search for distant relatives, cousins, great-grandparents, anyone who shared a genetic link. It wasn't magic. It wasn't guesswork. It was a roadmap built from living people. Morales pulled the locket from its evidence bag again, focusing on a tiny stain Reed had noted but couldn't analyze. Back then, it was meaningless. Today, it was enough to extract a partial profile. She sent it to the lab along with the fibers collected from the escort. Not because she expected immediate answers, but because this was the first step in shaking the dust off a case everyone thought was frozen. When the results came back, Morales didn't breathe for a moment. The DNA was too degraded for a direct hit, but strong enough for genealogical mapping. She authorized the upload into the National Genealogy Database. The waiting began. 3 days later, a cluster popped up. Not perfect matches, but relatives. Cousins. Second cousins. Branches of a family tree stretching across the Midwest. And that's when Morales noticed something that drained the color from her face. None of the genetic markers matched Thorne, Doss, or Damon Sterling. Not even remotely. The original suspects weren't just wrong, they were never even close. The real connection belonged to someone who had never been questioned, never been mentioned, never even been imagined. A ghost hiding inside a family tree. The genealogy report was nothing more than a web of distant relatives, scattered names, percentages, and shared DNA segments. To most investigators, it would have looked like a puzzle missing half its pieces. But Morales wasn't most investigators. She spread the printouts across her desk, connecting each relative with thin marker lines, building a branching structure that stretched back generations. It didn't matter that these were second or third cousins. What mattered was the direction the branches leaned. A pattern formed. All roads led to one family line originating in Wisconsin and splintering into Michigan sometime in the early 70s. The moment Morales saw that cluster tightening, she felt a pull in her gut, the same instinct Reed once lived by. She filtered the list by age, gender, proximity to Detroit in 1984. One by one, the names narrowed. Not suspects, just possibilities. People who shared blood with the unknown contributor. But one detail stood out. A male relative who moved to Michigan in 1981. Quiet background. Almost no criminal history. Employment records showing short-term jobs, never staying long. A pattern of leaving cities suddenly. Morales highlighted the name. A name that had never appeared in the original investigation. Not in interviews. Not in neighborhood reports. Not in any of the thousands of pages Reed once reviewed. This man existed entirely outside the 1,984 suspect circle. She checked the genealogy percentages again, her pulse steady but sharp. The match was strong enough to suggest a close connection, not distant, not random. Something immediate. Something direct. Morales leaned back in her chair as a realization washed over her. The person we've been looking for was never on the board. Not once. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, the case shifted. The past was no longer silent. Morales returned to the evidence box one more time, the genealogy chart still spread across her desk like a map pointing toward a truth nobody in 1984 could have imagined. She lifted the locket with gloved hands, studying it under a brighter lamp. The stain on the clasp, the one Reed treated as a meaningless smudge, was now the thread pulling the past straight into the present. But the breakthrough didn't come from the locket's surface. It came from the fibers. The escort had been processed in 1984 using the tools of that era, and most of the samples were dismissed as too small or too degraded. But Morales requested a new round of analysis anyway. Modern labs could extract profiles from fragments that once meant nothing. When the results landed in her inbox, she opened them slowly, bracing herself. A partial DNA match. Weak, but real. And connected to the same family cluster from the genealogy search. Not Thorne. Not Doss. Not Damon. Someone unexpected. Someone tied to the DNA profile through a direct line. Morales closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight settle. Then she opened the database again, filtered the relatives by proximity and age, and the name resurfaced. Arthur Jensen. A quiet mechanic. No criminal history. No known connection to Tahlia. Not a single witness mention. Not even a passing note in Reed's decades of work. A man invisible to the original investigation. Morales whispered the name once more, as if testing how it sounded in the room. Arthur Jensen. The name that would shatter 40 years of certainty. The case had finally awakened, and the person responsible had no idea what was coming. This next reveal changed everything. Stick with us. The morning the confirmation came in, Morales sat alone in the briefing room, the soft hum of overhead lights the only sound cutting through the stillness. On her laptop screen was the answer. Reed spent half his life chasing a name that had been hiding in plain sight, untouched by suspicion for 40 years. Arthur Jensen. Not a violent offender. Not a man with a shadowy reputation. Not someone neighbors warned their kids about. Just a quiet mechanic in Oak Park, a man who blended so well into everyday life that even his own block barely remembered him. The genealogical match wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to trigger the next step, a direct comparison using the fiber sample from the escort. When the second lab confirmed the familial connection, Morales exhaled slowly. The margin for coincidence was gone. Jensen wasn't a distant relative of the unknown DNA contributor. He was a close one. Blood level close. She pulled up his file, expecting to see anything that hinted at danger. But his record was thin. A minor charge from the late 72nds. Nothing violent. No complaints. No arrests. No red flags. A man without edges. But the deeper Morales looked, the more unsettling the picture became. He had lived in the Detroit area his entire adult life. He had moved addresses frequently, but never far, always within short drives of major roads. He had a steady employment pattern that seemed almost too clean. And then she reached the detail that made her sit up straighter, her pulse jumping. In 1984, on the night Tahlia Merrick disappeared, Arthur Jensen worked security at the Silver Skillet, the same diner where Tahlia stopped before heading toward her grandmother's house. A place he could watch her come and go. A place where he needed no excuse to be near her. The investigation had finally found its missing name. When Morales pulled Jensen's employment records, she expected to find gaps, unexplained disappearances, or sudden job changes that suggested hidden violence. That wasn't what she found at all. Jensen's life looked painfully ordinary, almost deliberately uneventful. He worked basic mechanical jobs, oil changes, tire rotations, brake repairs, the kind of work that keeps a person invisible because no one remembers the face of the man who fixed their muffler 3 years ago. His supervisors described him as reliable and easy to manage. Not friendly, not outgoing, just there. No complaints filed. No workplace conflicts. No patterns of instability. He rented instead of buying, paid bills on time, kept to himself. To anyone looking in from the outside, he seemed like the definition of harmless. And in 1984, that was enough to keep him off every suspect list. Morales read through his timeline again, tracing each year like stepping stones. Nothing jumped out until she cross-referenced his address history with known locations from Tahlia's last night. That's when the unease settled in. In 1984, Jensen lived less than a mile from the Silver Skillet. His shift ended shortly after Tahlia arrived that night. He would have seen her car pulling in. He would have seen her walk inside. He would have seen her leave. But the real problem wasn't what he saw. It was that no one ever saw him. His name never appeared in the original reports because no one bothered to look at the diner staff list. The investigators in 1984 chased dramatic leads, jealous exes, strange neighbors, outspoken colleagues, and ignored the man who quietly held the door open for late-night customers. A man whose silence protected him for decades. The kind of person who could watch without being noticed, follow without raising suspicion, disappear without leaving a ripple. The perfect ghost. The question Morales couldn't shake was the same one Reed had unknowingly wrestled with for decades. How did Arthur Jensen avoid every spotlight in 1984? The answer was unsettling in its simplicity. He blended into the kind of background people walk past every day without noticing. The Silver Skillet had a reputation for quick staff turnover back then, part-timers, night shifters, people picking up extra income. No one kept track of every employee, especially those working security roles that existed more for comfort than true enforcement. So when Tahlia vanished, detectives focused on people with louder stories. Her former partner, the odd neighbor, her colleague with motives. Rumors and theories drowned out the boring names. Jensen wasn't boring, he was invisible. He clocked out minutes before she walked back to her car. No confrontation. No argument. No witness alerting police to anything strange. Just a quiet man walking to the rear lot, keys in hand, watching a young woman leave the diner without realizing she was being observed. Morales kept reading through the old interviews and reports, searching for even a trace of him. There was none. No customers mentioned him. No staff remembered him. Not even the owner from that era could place his face when Morales tracked him down. It was as if he'd passed through the building like a shadow. That was the key. He didn't stand out. He didn't talk much. He didn't break rules or call attention to himself. Jensen moved through life like someone determined to leave no imprint at all. Which is why the truth felt even heavier. He wasn't overlooked. He designed his life that way. And it worked for 40 years. Morales stared at Jensen's name long after the screen dimmed to black. She didn't need more time, the truth was already settled. But accepting it required a moment of stillness. The kind that comes when a mystery finally turns itself inside out. His life looked harmless, almost painfully ordinary. His record was clean. His habits predictable. His movements unremarkable. And that was the problem. Danger often comes wrapped in routine. People trust quiet men because quietness feels safe. Morales pulled up Jensen's address history again, tracing the timeline from the early 82nds to the present day. He had lived in modest neighborhoods, worked steady jobs, and stayed out of the spotlight. Never married. No children. No close friends. A man who existed on the edge of every social circle. There were no outbursts, no arrests, no violent incidents. But there was one chilling constant. Jensen always lived near major roads that connected to places Tahlia frequented. Not because he was following her, but because he didn't need to. Their routines overlapped naturally. She lived her life openly. He moved quietly. Their paths crossed without either of them noticing. Until the wrong night. Morales leaned back, feeling a weight Reed had carried alone for decades. He hadn't failed the case. He had been searching in the wrong direction because the real threat designed his life to leave no trace. Jensen didn't slip through cracks. He built them. Her final action that night was simple. She wrote his name on a yellow sticky note and pressed it into the front of the case file. Arthur Jensen. The man nobody suspected because he wanted it that way. He lived unnoticed for 40 years. Stay alert, subscribe now. November 14th, 2024. The sky was still dark when unmarked SUVs rolled silently into Jensen's neighborhood. Frost clung to rooftops, the kind that makes the world look paused, held still just long enough for justice to catch up. Inside the lead vehicle, Sergeant Lena Morales reviewed the arrest plan one last time. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. She understood exactly what this moment meant. A 40-year hunt was ending on a street where neighbors watered plants and waved at each other every morning, completely unaware that a man hiding a violent secret lived among them. Morales gave a short nod. The team moved. Officers approached Jensen's house with deliberate steps, their breath fogging in the cold air. No sirens, no shouting, just the quiet march of a truth that had finally run out of places to hide. A single flash of light signaled the go-ahead. Arthur Jensen, open the door. Silence. Another knock. Then the faint sound of shoes moving across the floor. The lock clicked. Jensen opened the door slowly, dressed in a plain gray shirt, his expression unreadable. Not surprised. Not panicked. Just calm, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Morales stepped forward. Arthur Jensen, you are under arrest. He cut her off with a slight smirk. What took you so long? The words hit harder than any confession. No denial. No confusion. No attempt to run. Just a man acknowledging the end of his own silence. Officers secured his wrists. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A woman across the street gasped and covered her mouth. Phones lit up. The world around him shifted instantly. The quiet mechanic was no longer invisible. He was the headline. And Morales knew this was only the beginning. You'll want to hear what he confessed. Don't leave yet. Within minutes of Jensen being guided into the back of the cruiser, the entire street transformed. Porch lights flicked on. Curtains shifted. Doors opened just enough for neighbors to peek through, confusion etched across their faces. For decades, they'd waved at this man, borrowed tools from him, exchanged polite smiles at the mailbox. Now he was surrounded by officers, hands cuffed, face emotionless. Words spread faster than sunrise. By 6:10 a.m. phones buzzed all across Detroit. Group chats exploded. Local reporters scrambled toward Oak Park. Radio hosts cut into scheduled programs to announce breaking news. A major arrest has been made in the 1984 disappearance of Tahlia Merrick. When photos of Jensen being escorted out hit social media, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. Not him. He fixed my tire last month. He was always quiet, never caused trouble. How could someone like that be responsible? People struggle when danger looks ordinary. And Arthur Jensen was the definition of ordinary. As the convoy pulled away from the neighborhood, cameras captured Morales walking behind the cruiser, her expression firm but haunted. She knew this moment would ripple through every family that lived through 1984. Miles away, in a modest home Tahlia once visited as a teenager, Audrey Vance received the call. Detective Wells from the Cold Case Unit spoke softly. "We got him." She didn't answer right away. She didn't cry or cheer. She just sat down slowly, gripping the edge of her kitchen counter as if her body needed something solid to hold on to. Then the first tear fell. Then the next. And suddenly, she was shaking not from sadness, but from the release of 40 years of tension. After all this time, the silence had finally broken. The city felt it. The media felt it. And Audrey felt it the deepest. The convoy moved through early morning traffic with the urgency of a storm front. Flashing lights cut through the dim November sky as officers escorted Arthur Jensen toward Detroit Police Headquarters. Inside the back seat of the cruiser, he sat upright and silent, eyes fixed on the window as if he were watching a movie he'd already seen. He wasn't confused. He wasn't scared. There was a quiet acceptance in him, the kind that made every officer in that vehicle uneasy. Morales rode in the lead car, checking her radio, coordinating the arrival, and reminding herself to stay focused. But Jensen's expression replayed in her mind like a loop. That slight smirk, that steady stare, that unsettling line. "What took you so long?" Most suspects panicked during transport. Some begged. Others tried to proclaim innocence. But Jensen didn't say a single word. As they reached the downtown area, cameras were already stationed along the sidewalk. News vans lined the street. Traffic officers redirected cars. People gathered behind barricades, holding phones in the air, recording a man they'd never noticed before today. The cruiser stopped. Officers opened the rear door. Jensen stepped out as if attending a routine appointment. No resistance. No hesitation. Just a quiet walk toward a building that waited 4 decades for his arrival. Reporters shouted questions he ignored. What happened that night? Did you know her? Why now? He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't look at the crowd crushing against the barricades. Morales watched him closely. Something about his composure felt rehearsed. Not like a man shocked by arrest, but like someone expecting a chapter to close. Inside, the interrogation room lights were already warming up. The truth was finally within reach. The interrogation room was simple metal table, 2 chairs, a recording device, and walls that held decades of unsolved questions. Morales entered first, dropping Jensen's file on the table with a quiet thud. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Everything he'd hidden was finally out in the open. Jensen was already seated, hands resting calmly on the table. No fidgeting, no anxiety. Just a steady, patient stare that made Morales feel like he was the one evaluating her. She sat down slowly. "Arthur," she began, "you know why you're here." He nodded once, as though she were confirming an appointment rather than questioning him about one of the most haunting cases in Detroit history. Morales opened the file. "We've matched DNA from the evidence collected in 1984. It connects to you." Still no reaction. "And your employment records confirm you were at the Silver Skillet the night Tahlia Merrick disappeared." His eyes shifted not in fear, but with a kind of acknowledgement, like he'd been waiting for someone to finally say her name. Morales leaned forward. "This is your opportunity to tell the truth. 40 years, Arthur. 40 years of silence." For a long moment he didn't speak. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the space between them. Then Jensen exhaled slowly and whispered words that made Morales freeze. "I always knew you'd come back for her." It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was an opening. A door creaking open after decades of being sealed shut. Morales steadied her voice. "Tell me what happened that night." Jensen's lips curved into a faint, unsettling smile. "Where do you want me to start?" The truth was finally at the edge of the table. "You'll want to hear what he confessed. Don't leave yet." The moment Morales pressed the record button, the room shifted. Jensen leaned back in his chair, eyes half lowered, as if he were replaying a memory he kept buried for decades. This wasn't the posture of a man being interrogated. This was someone preparing to unload a story he'd carried alone for far too long. Morales kept her voice steady. "Start with the reason you followed her." Jensen let out a short breath, not nervous, but reflective. "I didn't plan anything," he said quietly. "Not at first." Those words were the closest thing to remorse he showed. He explained how his life had been falling apart in 1984, the overdue bills, the eviction notice taped to his kitchen counter, The final argument with his ex-wife before she walked out, leaving behind nothing but a silver locket she refused to take with her. He worked nights at the Silver Skillet because it was the only shift no one else wanted. I saw her come in, he continued. She looked tired. She sat by the window. I didn't think anything of it. But when Tahlia left the diner, Jensen followed her into the parking lot, not because he recognized her, not because he had a grudge, but because he saw an opening. I thought she'd leave the car unattended for a minute. I thought I could get it running and be gone before she came back. Morales didn't flinch, but inside her stomach tightened. This wasn't a story of obsession, or vengeance, or personal connection. It was desperation, the kind born from a life collapsing inward. That's all it was at the beginning, Jensen said. I needed the car. I needed something to sell. His voice lowered. But she came back sooner than I expected. And with that, the confession deepened. If this confession is as disturbing to you as it is to us, comment below. Jensen shifted in his seat, fingers tapping lightly on the table, as if the weight of this part pressed harder than the rest. She walked out fast, he said. Keys in hand. I didn't expect that. He admitted he panicked, stepped back into the shadow near the dumpster behind the diner, hoping she wouldn't notice him. But when Tahlia unlocked her red Escort, Jensen saw something he hadn't prepared for. She checked the back seat, the passenger side, even glanced over her shoulder before getting in, like someone who understood caution all too well. She was alert, he whispered. Way more than I expected. For a second he claimed he considered giving up. Let the moment pass. Let her go home, live her life, and pretend the thought never crossed his mind. But when she pulled out, he continued. I followed anyway. Morales leaned in, face unreadable. Why? His answer landed like a blow. Because I convinced myself I deserved that car more than she did. He said it with a dryness that made the room feel colder. He followed her taillights through Southfield, past closing storefronts, past families heading home, past people who would claim for decades that they saw nothing unusual that night. He stayed far enough behind to avoid suspicion, close enough that he wouldn't lose her. She stopped at a signal, Jensen said softly. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment that decides everything. Tahlia didn't know a stranger was tracking her. She didn't know someone else's troubles were about to collide with her life. She didn't know she had just become the target of a man who had convinced himself the world owed him something. She turned into her neighborhood, Jensen said, and I followed. The confession was only getting darker. Jensen stared at the table as he explained what happened next, his voice flattening into something mechanical as if removing emotion would make the memory easier to spill. When she parked, he said, I waited until she went inside. I thought she'd be quick. Drop something off. Come back out. His plan was simple in his mind, slip into the Escort, get it running, disappear before she stepped back outside. But Tahlia didn't return as fast as he expected. Minutes passed. His impatience grew. His desperation sharpened. I walked up to the car, he said, tried the handle, locked. He paused, jaw tightening. I should have left. But he didn't. Instead, he crept toward the entrance of the duplex. A light was on in the kitchen. He claimed he only meant to knock to create a distraction, draw her outside, slip past her. That was the thought, he insisted. But desperation twists even basic thoughts into dangerous ones. When no one came to the door, Jensen tried the knob. It moved. Tahlia didn't lock it, he said quietly. That changed everything. The living room was dim still, the kind of calm that should have signaled him to walk out immediately. Instead, he stepped inside, driven by a reckless belief that if he just grabbed her keys, he could solve all his problems in one night. I wasn't thinking straight, he muttered. I wasn't thinking at all. He moved through the space, saw the half-packed suitcase, the purse on the couch, the keys on the counter. When I reached for them, he said, she came out of the hallway. Morales didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. In that split second, two lives collided, one fighting for control, the other blindsided in her own home. And the struggle began. Jensen swallowed hard before continuing, the rhythm of his voice shifting, no longer calm, no longer detached. This was the part he had avoided for 40 years. She saw me near the counter, he said. She froze for a second, like she was trying to understand what she was looking at. Tahlia didn't scream. She didn't plead. She reacted like someone who had faced threats before and refused to back down. She grabbed the nearest thing she could reach, a glass from the sink, and threw it at me, Jensen said. Caught me right on the cheek. There was almost a flicker of respect in his tone, like he hadn't expected someone her size to hit with that much force. She kept yelling for me to get out, he said, tried to shove me toward the door. Morales kept her pen still. She wasn't writing anymore, she was listening. Jensen claimed he tried to push past her, reach the keys, make a run for it, but Tahlia blocked him with everything she had: hands, elbows, her entire body weight. She fought, he said quietly. Harder than anyone I've ever seen. There was no hesitation in the way he described it. She clawed at his jacket, tried to grab the phone, tried to get to the door, tried anything that might give her even the smallest chance to escape. She wasn't scared, he murmured. She was angry, and that anger cornered him. It wasn't supposed to go that far, he claimed, though the words held no comfort. But she wouldn't let me leave. Jensen admitted he grabbed her wrist, trying to stop her from reaching the phone. She slipped, hit the edge of the counter, stumbled, and everything spun out of control from there. It happened fast, he said softly. Too fast. The room fell silent. Jensen's voice thinned as he reached the part he had circled around for most of his life, the moment he could never soften, no matter how many excuses he built to shield himself from it. She hit the counter hard, he said. I remember the sound. It wasn't loud, it was sharp. Tahlia tried to pull herself back up, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, the other reaching for something, maybe balance, maybe a weapon, maybe a hope that she could push through the pain long enough to get away. She kept swinging, Jensen said quietly. Even hurt, she wouldn't stop. He stepped toward her, trying to grab her shoulders, trying to get her away from the phone, trying, according to him, to end the fight long enough to escape. But Tahlia wouldn't surrender. She caught me across the face again, he said, touching the faint scar Morales had noticed earlier. That's when I grabbed her. Harder than I meant to. He claimed he only wanted to shove her off him. He claimed panic drowned out common sense. He claimed everything spiraled from one violent mistake. She lost her footing, he whispered, hit the floor, hard. There was a pause. A long one. She didn't get back up. For the first time since his arrest, Jensen's voice wavered. I knelt down to check if she was breathing. That's when the locket slipped out of my jacket. He stared at the wall as if reliving the sound of it hitting the tile. I didn't notice I dropped it, not until later. The irony stung. A small piece of his past, something he didn't even value, became the thread that would eventually expose him. Morales didn't speak. She let the silence judge him. When the verdict was announced, Audrey Vance didn't cheer. She didn't collapse. She didn't even blink at first. She simply stood there with her hands clasped tightly, breathing through a storm of emotions she had carried since she was 24. She waited 40 years for this moment, and the people who should have been standing beside her were gone. Her mother, who spent every birthday setting a plate for a daughter who never came home. Her father, who aged faster than any man should because he refused to stop searching. Both buried before they could see the truth finally break through the silence. Audrey's voice trembled as she spoke outside the courthouse. I'm grateful, she said softly, but this victory came too late for the two people who fought the hardest. It wasn't just justice for her sister. It was the final chapter of a wound that had reshaped her entire life, her relationships, her career, her idea of trust, her belief in institutions that failed them when it mattered most. People saw her as strong, but they didn't see the nights she stayed awake replaying the last phone call she ever had with Tahlia, or the guilt she felt for decades, wondering if she missed something, wondering if she should have checked on her sooner, wondering if the world cared enough. Now she stood in the cold November air, holding her sister's locket, the same one that misled detectives for years, the same one that eventually helped expose a monster. Justice had come. But justice without the people who needed it most felt like half a victory. Audrey wiped her tears, looked at the reporters, and said one final line. My sister mattered. Don't let anyone say otherwise. Detective Michael Reed watched the courtroom empty long after everyone else had left. He sat in the same row he'd chosen during every hearing, hands folded, shoulders heavy, staring at the space where Jensen had stood just minutes earlier. For most people, this was the end of a long-awaited story. For Reed, It was the closing of a chapter that shaped 4 decades of his identity. Back in 1984, Reed was young, driven, and determined to prove himself. Tahlia's disappearance swallowed him whole. He carried her file everywhere: car seat, bedside table, office desk. While other cases faded into archives, hers became the one he could never put down. Over the years, he paid a steep price. He missed anniversaries. He forgot birthdays. He shut out friends. He watched promising suspects collapse into dead ends and felt the weight of every wrong turn. He remembered the day Audrey asked him, "Do you think we'll ever know the truth?" He told her yes, even though he didn't believe it anymore. Now, sitting in that same courtroom, Reed finally exhaled, but the release didn't bring happiness. It brought exhaustion, the kind that reaches the bones. He touched the worn corner of Tahlia's original case file, still held together with the tape he added back in the 90 seconds. Morales offered to digitize it years ago, but he refused. The paper reminded him she was real, a person, not a statistic. When Morales approached and placed a hand on his shoulder, Reed whispered the words he'd waited a lifetime to say, "She can rest now." Only then did his composure crack. Not because Jensen was finally exposed, but because Reed no longer had to carry Tahlia's silence alone. When Sergeant Lena Morales stepped out of the courthouse, she was greeted by flashing cameras, microphones, and applause she never asked for. She didn't bask in it. She didn't smile. She simply folded her arms and stared at the reporters, like someone who understood that justice is never a victory, it's a responsibility. The truth is, Morales had walked into the cold case unit expecting resistance. She was younger than most of the detectives who once handled Tahlia's file. She didn't have their memories of 1984, their assumptions, or their personal ties. What she did have was an unwillingness to accept conclusions built on guesses. She took one look at the locket stain, a detail long dismissed, and refused to let it stay quiet. She revisited a car fiber everyone had forgotten about. She challenged decades of, "We checked that already." And she pushed, even when it annoyed senior staff. Morales didn't just solve a case. She reopened a wound the city had convinced itself was scar tissue, forcing everyone to confront the truth. A mistake wasn't just made, it was lived with. During the press briefing, a reporter asked her how it felt to bring closure to a 40-year mystery. Her answer was simple. "I didn't bring closure, I brought truth. The closure belongs to the people who waited." Audrey hugged her afterward, holding her tightly, whispering a thank you only Morales could hear. It wasn't gratitude for solving a file, it was gratitude for refusing to let a young woman's story fade into dust. As the crowd thinned out, Morales looked toward the courthouse steps, the weight of what she uncovered settling into her expression. She didn't just solve the case. She forced history to correct itself. While the courtroom celebrated one truth finally coming to light, 3 men watched the headlines from a distance, not because they didn't care, but because the moment brought back memories they had spent years trying to bury. Harrison Thorne, once a respected journalist. Reginald Doss, the misunderstood neighbor everyone whispered about. Damon Sterling, the ex-boyfriend, whose grief was twisted into suspicion. All 3 had lived under a shadow they never earned. When Tahlia vanished, their names became cautionary tales. Employers turned cold. Families questioned them. Friends kept their distance. They didn't lose freedom. They lost reputation, opportunities, peace, and in some cases, the trust of people they loved. Thorne eventually left Detroit, saying he was tired of being recognized for a crime he had nothing to do with. Doss became withdrawn, choosing silence over the endless stares. Damon struggled the most. He carried guilt that wasn't his, believing deep down that if he had been a better partner, maybe Tahlia would have never crossed Jensen's path. Morales reached out to all 3 men after the arrest, offering them the clarity they were denied decades earlier. Most thanked her. One cried. Another simply hung up. The truth was welcome, but it came far too late. They didn't get apologies from the public. They didn't get the years back. They didn't get the lives they were building before suspicion poisoned everything. As Audrey said during the press conference, they were victims too, just in a different way. This case didn't just take Tahlia's life. It scraped away pieces of theirs. Justice finally spoke for Tahlia Merrick. Time, however, never returned what these men lost along the way. When the courtroom doors closed and the crowds thinned, Detroit was left with a truth far heavier than the verdict. The threat they feared in 1984 wasn't loud, violent, or obvious. It was quiet, ordinary, forgettable, and for 40 years, that made it almost impossible to see. People like Jensen terrify communities not because they stand out, but because they don't. He wasn't the person neighbors warned their kids about. He wasn't someone who stirred trouble, raised alarms, or caused tension. He blended into sidewalks, workplaces, driveways, and routines. And that's the part of this case that hurt the city the most. This wasn't a monster hiding in shadows. It was a man holding open doors for strangers, making small talk at the grocery store, and waving politely to neighbors who never imagined they should be afraid. The lesson Detroit carries now is simple. Danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits quietly, unnoticed. For people like Audrey, this truth came at a crushing cost. For families who lost trust in their community, the wound may never fully close. And for Reed, who spent a lifetime chasing a ghost, the lesson is carved into the years he can't get back. But this story also stands as a reminder, a necessary one, that no case is too old, no clue too small, and no silence too long to be broken. And if there's something this channel believes in, it's that forgotten stories deserve a voice. Stay aware, stay informed. Subscribe for stories that expose hidden truths. And for those watching who still haven't subscribed, if you won't subscribe, tell us why in the comments.